Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at the National University of Ireland, Galway. We're really delighted to be hosting this session with Dr. Nessa Cronin, who's an associate director in the Moore Institute, on a subject of the utmost importance, which has dominated thoughts over the last many weeks and months, in fact, but of course, coming to great particular focus in Glasgow. Our subject is climate change and the arts. A post-Cop26 conversation. So thank you again to Nessa for convening this event, to David Kelly and the Moore Institute for running things behind the scenes. Very much looking forward to today's discussion. And I'm going to hand over now to Jeremy Torney, who's going to kick things off. So Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dan, and hello everyone, and welcome from me. I'm the chair of Future Earth Ireland, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Law and Government in Dublin City University. And Future Earth Ireland are delighted to be working with the Moore Institute to co-host this afternoon's webinar. So what's Future Earth Ireland, you might be asking yourself? Future Earth globally is a network of scientists, researchers and innovators that aims to provide the knowledge needed to support transformations towards sustainability. And Future Earth Ireland is convened by the Royal Irish Academy and is the national committee of Future Earth. Our committee is composed of members of a diverse range of academic disciplines, as well as people from business and policy making in the sustainability space. And as I said, we're delighted to be involved in today's webinar, and I'm very much looking forward to the contributions of our various panelists. The discussion, as Dan said, today is taking place at a critical time for the world in respect of climate action. The COP26 climate conference in Glasgow drew global attention to the climate crisis. It was framed by many, the conference that is, was framed by many as a last best chance to combat the climate crisis. But in reality, it was never going to be a once and for all solution to the climate crisis. Was the outcome enough? I think by any objective measure, the answer to that question has to be no. The conference and the events around it laid bare the wide gap between what we know we have to do, the transformational change required, and the current level of ambition globally. But the conference also made important progress, and it sets a framework in place for strengthening the global response to the climate crisis over the coming years. But of course, the commitments announced in the glare of the global media are only meaningful if they are put into action. And therefore, the focus now must shift from that global level, from COP26 in Glasgow, to implementation of climate action and sustainability measures at domestic level. And as a rich, developed country, Ireland has a particular responsibility. Our emissions per capita are stubbornly high, even by the standards of other developed countries. And in some ways, to me at least, it feels like we're only really scratching the surface. We're only really beginning the journey to a cleaner, greener future. Ireland's national climate law, passed earlier this year, provides a framework for scaling up our collective response to climate action and holding our government to account if it fails to deliver on the promises it has made. Under that legal framework, under the climate law, the government published, in fact, as the COP26 conference was ongoing in Glasgow, published a climate action plan that, if you like, maps out that pathway forward. And it makes clear the scale of the transformation needed, but the real work is still ahead. The real work of bending the emissions curve downward here in Ireland and globally is only really beginning. And I think this is where the arts have a critical role to play, and a role that to date has been underexplored. And so I'm really excited to hear the perspectives of our panelists this afternoon. And with that, I'd like to hand back over now to Dr. Nessa Cronin.
Great, thanks very much, Diarmuid, and to Dan as well too. We're delighted to have everybody joining us here at virtual Galway this afternoon, but in particular to share and to listen and learn from the artists who've been working on the front line in many ways of the climate and the biodiversity crisis as well in recent years. So anna fáilte roibh go léir mada leis chun bheith ann in our láthair inniuh leis an seminar agus an webinar seo. Tá an also bheith ann agus tuaithin freisin a bheith in our go luadar inniuh. You're all very welcome to this webinar, and in particular, as we had discussed and as Diarmuid and Dan had said, you know, many of us are now very well aware and listening to many of the issues in relation to the climate and the biodiversity crisis in recent years. But as Diarmuid said as well, one of the issues in particular that has maybe received less attention is the role of the arts and what the arts have done, what they can do, and how we need to further embed them in terms of critical infrastructure, in terms of addressing the planetary predicament that we now face, particularly over the next decade as well. So at FEI Ireland, we had been discussing issues around COP26, and we had anticipated that a lot of the discussion would be really based on governmental policy, looking at aspects of progressing international agreements, multilateral agreements, both across different sectors and indeed across different countries and regions as well. However, we were very concerned also that the question of culture and what the arts are more widely, which are an expression of a culture in a place and in a time, was going to be maybe not receive the same amount of attention as it should do. And if we take into account the fact that culture has been recognized as the fourth pillar of sustainability, so that if you don't take cultural forms and cultural understandings into account, then as Charles Joly and his colleagues have written recently in the London School of Economics, if you don't take that into account, then any progress or any ideas around sustainability might indeed be doomed not to be very successful in the future, or will have very limited success. So ignoring culture and ignoring the arts is really where we're limiting our progress in this area. So this webinar today, we're delighted, seeks to address this important gap in public policy and in discourse as well, looking in relation to the role of the arts and culture more widely can play in addressing these environmental and planetary challenges, both across the island of Ireland, in Europe and internationally as well. In particular, we wanted to foreground the artists themselves. So we're delighted to have a wide range of arts practitioners and those directly working in the area of arts and humanities in the discussion today. And we're delighted to have also bring in wider discussions with you in the audience as well in the Q&A afterwards as well. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite all of the attendees. Feel free to put questions or comments into the Q&A button at the end of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to get to them over the course of the afternoon. So the kind of the progress for what we're hoping to do is that each speaker will have 5 minutes just to maybe frame their own practice, also to frame their own work in this area, and to set forward maybe 2 or 3 ideas that they've been working with or through to open up the discussions later in the Q&A part of the session. So we'll move through very quickly. Everybody will have their 5 minutes, and then at the end we'll have an open discussion then, and invite the audience as well to participate in that as well too. But firstly, just a very few comments on the role of the arts as well. So the founder and CEO of Julie's Bicycle, Alison Tickle, was asked about the role of the arts in Scotland, and of course they're based up in Scotland as well during COP26. And in an interview, she said, "No amount of data, science, or technology can ever make us feel the world in the same way as art can." And it brings up this question of why are the arts important? And how I think we can look at this today is thinking about what kinds of knowledge do they store, hold, capture, and captivate, and why is this important in helping us to think through ways of addressing the current planetary predicament. There's an old Irish proverb that's used by Manchán Magan in some of his work, and his latest work as well, 32 Words for Field. And it's a really interesting proverb, so I'll just share it with you now, and then we can move into the bigger part of the seminar then. So the proverb goes, sail trí via vor, sail umara voin, sail trí umara, sail an dawan. And that translates as 3 times the life of a whale is the lifespan of a ridge, and 3 times the life of a ridge is the lifespan of the world. So as Mann explains, these words encapsulate just how far back the knowledge contained within the Irish language stretches across this island. In those times, a whale was thought to live for 1,000 years, and so it was known that the cultivation ridges that we see dotted in the fields around us, particularly in the west of Ireland, could be up to 3,000 years old. So this is one way in which knowledge is stored in language, in culture, in heritage, in different ways, but it also tells us, I suppose, in terms of how culture can encapsulate the extent and the expanse of the web of life in many ways, whether it's human life, animal life, plant, geographical and geological life in different ways as well too. And this is really important for us to remember, I think, in terms of what Robert Welch said as well. At a time of crisis, the language in which we speak about it is very important, and we need to be attendant to that kind of discourse and language, whether it takes the form of visual language, musical, acoustical language, or even bodily language as well. All of these things are very important. So without further ado, we'll move very swiftly, looking at all of these different issues via the lens of the artists today. And I'm delighted to welcome Deirdre O'Mahony. So Deirdre, if you'd like to put on your camera, please. Wonderful to have Deirdre back with us in Galway. Deirdre is a visual artist whose practice is informed by deep interest in rural sustainability, farming, food security, and rural-urban relationships. For more than 2 decades, she has investigated the political ecology of rural places through public engagement, archival and moving image installation, critical writing, and cultural production. So Deirdre, I'll pass it over to you, and thanks a million for being with us today.
Thank you, Nessa. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for the opportunity to enter into the conversation here today. I'm not seeing myself here, so I'm not sure if I'm visible. My art practice has been focused on thinking about land, landscape, and how to face the crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change that we're in right now. Thus far, humanities' approach has really been about moving forward faster, harder, better. And against that kind of anthropocentric production and consumption, that notion of anthropocentric production and consumption, design theorist Tony Fry put forward the idea of the sustainment as an equivalent moment to the Enlightenment in its capacity to transform systems of thoughts and behavior. And I really like the notion of the sustainment as a way of thinking about how we might shift the current unsustainable mode that we're in right now, and consider the world in all its diversity, both human and non-human, and the needs of everyone. My art practice has been informed, as Nessa said, by my experience as an artist living in rural Ireland. And I lived for a long time in the West, in the Burren, and seeing and sometimes experiencing the environmental conflicts and attitudes towards differences of opinion about habitats, tourism, developments over 25 years have left me grappling with questions about how to understand, think through the complexities about the attachments that we have about land and landscape in Ireland. And I think this is particularly urgent now as policies nervously respond to the demands of climate change and also to global capital, and the kind of crisis that we're in right now. And I think in order to consider how decisions are made about policies, about whose voice gets heard, who gets consulted about the way that policies are enacted on the ground. And what lessons perhaps have been learned from conflicts that seem to repeat themselves over and over again, endlessly, like a rather bad version of Groundhog Day, without ever seeming to address the causes or thinking about who is most directly affected by the consequences of top-down decision-making. And my practice really has been about trying to create a kind of public space to allow for the examination of decisions about land use and legislation and how that plays out on the ground, but also about surfacing and making visible the knowledge and the practices of the people who are working the land, whether it's farmers or food producers of varying sorts. And this has been the focus of my my practice, particularly over the last few years. So in thinking through these kind of questions about how to create a public space, I've kind of moved from an aesthetic practice that saw landscape as a kind of subject to thinking about the very stuff of the land itself, soil, upon which our survival depends, and thinking about how to engender a kind of collective political ecology that considers interspecies dependency. So my new project, going back to my introduction, my current thinking is a project called Sustainment Experiments that's taking Tony Fry's idea of the sustainment in order to focus urgently on farming, food production, biodiversity loss, and soil health. And so the image you see behind me is of ridges, and it was timely you mentioned the ridges, Nessa. These are potato ridges that made by a group that I often collaborate with called the Irish Loy Association of Ireland. These ridges are in the shape of an I Ching hexagram that was cast in response to the question, what's the future of sustainable food production in Ireland? And the answer was really interesting. The answer was modesty creates success, balance and adjust things by cutting through pride and complication, reduce what's overdeveloped, don't try to advance yourself, beware of conceit and arrogance, be consistent and resilient, don't follow policy, do the right thing. I can't think of better advice. So I'm giving this example as it works on a number of levels. It works as a sign, as a symbol, as an agricultural demonstration. It's now planted with a crop called sandfoin that sequesters nitrogen and improves soil health and has a whole raft of other biodiversity benefits. And, you know, I'll conclude by saying that and other experiments in the project are a way of opening a space for public discussion. I'm not an expert. I don't put myself forward as representing any particular sectoral interest, but I do see the kind of speculative space that artists can contribute as vitally important to having, to reimagining what kind of strategies we might adopt in the face of climate change. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Deirdre. That's fantastic, and I'm delighted that we got the ridges in there for you as well too, which is super. Deirdre's work on the potato and spud as well has been kind of noted internationally. She's worked across from Ireland to England to Morocco to Peru, and indeed looking at all different issues around climate justice and communities as well. And I think we'll return to a lot of those comments, I think, Deirdre, as well in the Q&A, because I think that's opening up lots of points of discussion there. Our Oh, sorry. We're delighted to have Siobhan MacDonald with us. And Siobhan is here with us after coming back from France, I think, Siobhan. So you're very welcome back on Irish soil again. And just say thank Deirdre as well, just for her comments there. We'll be returning to a lot of those, I think, afterwards as well, too, particularly opening up this idea of speculative spaces, and the idea of opening up a space for discussions and public discourse is vitally important. So Siobhan is well known to many in the arts community in Ireland and internationally. She's an artist in residence at the School of Natural Sciences in Trinity in Dublin. She's working with the European Space Agency and the GRC European Commission to explore ecology in the light of current ecological and climate concerns. And her work kind of works across many different forms, including painting, drawing, film, and sound. So Deirdre, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for having me on this discussion. I'm delighted to share my work and my thoughts today. I want to talk a little bit about the process of the art and the scientist relationship. And I think that collaborations between artists and scientists are at their most valuable when they're not seen simply as a process of artists learning from scientists, but rather as a sort of reciprocal exchange in which ideas travel in both directions. And, you know, in a lot of the residencies I've done in the last number of years, I've come to think that that dynamic relationship is so important to harness because of this idea of creating something new and these hybrid practices coming together and trying to address some of the topics that you've raised today, that comes out of these very, very important, sort of sometimes delicate and fragile connections between totally different disciplines. A very good example, I think, of how to put these, to interface the artist and scientist relationship is how CERN was set up, the arts practicing school there. And Ariane Cook, as a curator, made a very important comment that when she set up this, this interface, that she thought it was very important not to have any demands put on the artists, that there should be no sense of an output, that people would have a time to dream up and to think and create and embed themselves in these subjects to do with what is happening to the earth and how can we address a new way of thinking, a new way of knowledge making. And in order to do that, she also said that artists had to be paid with equal status to the scientists. So the artists were paid the same amount as the scientists, which is fantastic, and really has paved the way for a lot of very interesting art science collaborations around the world. My own direct experience in the last number of years, I'm working with the bogs of Ireland and I'm working with soil science. Currently, I'm embedded in a project in the EU Commission where I'm working with Arwen Jones, who's a scientist, and his job is basically to change policy around how soil is addressed. In this year, soil is one of the 5 on the top agenda. So I'm in this really fruitful position where I'm an artist talking to him constantly about what he's trying to do, how he's trying to fix the soil problem and address fertilization and crops, growing food, etc. And he's extremely open, because of this approach that we have, extremely open to looking back into historical practices of planting and food making and sort of cultures and civilizations, and how people have addressed these notions historically. And I think it's a really, really important to bring up, because if we are talking about artists and scientists talking together about trying to address these situations, it's important to boil it back and to unpack it to see how these two dynamic forces come together. art can be such a powerful tool in relaying these paramount messages to audiences. And if we use it to communicate, we have to drive emotional experience to shed light. And I think if we want to change something about the climate, it has to be explicit, it has to be physical, you have to engage the senses. It has to be visceral, so that the sense of interrupting the status quo or the form of thinking, because in order to do that, I think we need to make an emotional connection so that people aren't just reading about science or looking at statistics, but we're actually beginning to see culture in a different way. And it's an important step towards motivating people, not just to know something, but to respond to it and feel the urgency to take action themselves. So to encourage viewers to reflect upon their understanding and perception of the physical world that surround them, I think we have to consider how we're impacting the planet. So I wanted to share some of my work at this time. I'm not sure what time it is, but some of the projects that I'm doing, this is a project that I started on the Arctic Circle, where I was, I'm not sure if I can actually flick. Perhaps, Nessa, can you help me?
Yeah, sure.
I'll move across, the images aren't moving.
Okay. If you could stop maybe sharing your screen and I'll see if I can share mine, okay?
Okay.
No worries. You could keep talking there while I get this sorted here. No worries.
Okay. Well, I can just keep talking.
Or if you want to keep talking there, actually, because we have about a minute left, if that's okay, Siobhan.
Okay. So I hope that helped there. So I go to very fragile places in the earth where I try to see climate change in action. One of the places that I go to in a recurring fashion is Vatnajökull Glacier in Iceland, and also different parts of the archipelago of Svalbard, where I have been measuring glacial retreat with some scientists and trying to also record how the wildlife is responding to the seismic shifts that's happening under the glaciers. So for instance, this summer, I'm going to be going back to the Arctic to work with an oceanographer, listening to how the sound of the whale song has changed. In particular, since COVID, the sense of seismic hushing that's happened around the world, where noise pollution hasn't been as prevalent as it has been, so that nature has had a chance to basically respond in a different way, and these very subtle sounds of nature have been making a massive shift. And I'll be recording this. Can we move to the next slide? No.
I think maybe the time might be up.
Okay, that's perfect.
That's okay. I think what we can do is we can return to it at the Q&A, and I can share the slides on my screen. If you would be able to stop your screen share there, that would be great.
Okay, sure thing.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, everybody.
Not at all. Thanks a million, Siobhan.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're delighted now to have Nessa Homani, and Nessa and myself were just chatting, that it's really nice to have two Nessas in the Zoom room. So delighted to have Nessa Homani here with us today, and she's also here as well with her co-editor of a recent book that they produced, The Empty House, Poetry and Prose on the Climate Crisis. Nessa is a Dublin-born poet and novelist. She's published 5 books of poetry, mostly published by Salmon Press as well, the wonderful Salmon Press. Her 5th collection, The Hollow Woman on the Island, was published by Salmon in 2019, and she's the co-editor with Alice Kinsella, who's also here with us in the Zoom room today, of The Empty House. So we invited Nessa and Alice here today to talk about their own work, but also in terms of the editing of that collection, which is a wonderful collection of prose and poetry, which I would recommend to put on everybody's Christmas list. So Nessa, I'll pass it over to you for now, just to say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nessa, and it is lovely to be part of this conversation. One of the earliest known verses evoking a sense of the seasons is the 12th century lyric, the Cuckoo Song, which goes, "Summer is a coming in, groweth seed and bloweth mead, and springeth the wood anew, sing cuckoo. So obviously from time immemorial, the arrival of the cuckoo has been the harbinger of spring, with letters to the paper joyfully reporting its first song, and amateur photographers scouring the countryside in the hope of capturing an image of that elusive icon. Earlier this month, when doing my far too regular scroll through various Facebook groups, I came across this entry to the Irish Wild Birds and Animals group. It was a post from a lady called Angela Liddy. Cuckoo in Ireland in November. Just out walking in woods in County Roscommon today, 7th of November, and unbelievably, we heard a cuckoo. We had heard them around here as expected from end of April through to June. Usually they fall silent around June and then presumably at some stage depart for Africa. But we've never ever heard one here or anywhere in Ireland in November. We heard 4 distinct calls in 2 locations close to one another. Is this climate change in action or a lazy bird? There were many responses questioning whether Angela had in fact heard a dove or a pigeon or countless other birds that might mimic the distinctive sound of the cuckoo. But she remained adamant that she knew what she'd heard, and other posters began to chime in with details of other seasonal presences. Goldfinch fledglings in their garden, or wasps, or overwintering swallows. Clearly, the unseasonal warmth of recent months may have contributed to some confusion in the natural world about whether to migrate, or wake up, or enter dormancy. And whether this becomes a trend or is just a blip remains to be seen. But for the writer, particularly those of us attuned to the natural rhythms of nature and the world as sources of inspiration, part of a tradition that goes back to the anonymous composer of the Cuckoo Song, such events are deeply worrisome. They point to something, to the sometimes insidious nature of climate change. Things alter without us necessarily noticing them. And then suddenly the annual delights we've become accustomed to are no more. For many years, we had a flock of swifts nesting in the barns of old houses around the new estates being built at the Rathfarnham edge of the Dublin Mountains where I live. It was sheer joy to go out in a misty morning in July, knowing you'd be surrounded by scores of agile birds, swooping and rising as they fed on the midges and insects that seemed always to come with such weather. And then one July, not that long ago, I walked through the same estates looking in vain for even a single swift. I wrote about my sense of loss in the poem Absence, and this is an extract. Was it last year that swifts carved their curve here, or the year before? The nest on the burglar alarm has crumbled. A winter storm washed away any other trace, like the names of things we knew only yesterday. Yes, the loss is creeping and insidious for the very fact that we don't often notice it. I think sometimes that in this increasingly digitized and digital age, we are losing more and more of a sense of ourselves as human animals with instincts and responses that follow natural cycles. There's an app for everything now. They make cars that will do the driving for us and stop in the middle of the road if they perceive a steep incline to be an obstacle, which happened to me in County Kerry this summer. They don't trust our human judgment or our ability to use our own senses. And when we delegate that ability to our devices, we are diminished. Perhaps my generation is too fatalistic about the challenges of climate change. We are good at old wailing new woes, to borrow from Shakespeare, and we fill our pages with the latest signs of shift in the natural world. But maybe we are less likely to take to the streets and protest. What I so admire about younger generations, who we have left down so badly in our curation of the world, is their preparedness to fight, to challenge, and to change. Writers should be at the forefront of that challenge, drawing people's attention to what they might have missed, what they may not yet realize that they will lose. When Alice Kinsella and I edited Empty House, the anthology of writing on the climate crisis published by Thura Press earlier this year, we wondered if we'd find it hard to persuade writers to tackle such a huge subject, but quite the opposite. In their own wonderful and unique ways, each contributor found their own measure, their own way of putting a mark on the sand, of reinstating their own places in the world. So we may not hold back the rising waters, but we'll certainly go down trying. And if there are 3 things to maybe bring forward to the later discussion, I would just use three phrases: notice, witness, and don't give up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nessa. As you were speaking, and also I was kind of thinking of Siobhan as well, about the need to have these conversations across different times and spaces. I think it's so important, again, to be reminded, and particularly in the work that you and Alice have put together as well, in terms of how art is not just a mirror to society, or a mode of reflection, or a form of science communication, as Siobhan was saying as well, but that art in itself, in all of its forms, is a way of knowledge creation, and indeed a way of creating a whole new system of knowledge and values and meanings, I think, and that need to fit to the world in which we're living now in many ways. But I'm delighted to have Alice Kinsella here with us this afternoon again, to be here with her partner in crime, Nessa. So Alice, you're very welcome. Delighted to have you back in Galway. And we're delighted to have Alice here speaking about her own work, but also her work as a curator, but also in terms of being an editor of the volume as well. Alice's poetry, her own work, has appeared in many different areas in recent years, in Banshee, the Irish Times, Poetry Ireland Review, the North, and the multi-poetry project Krakow, amongst others. Her work has been translated into Polish, Arabic, and Greek, and she's received a number of residencies and bursaries from different festivals and summer schools and arts awards in recent years. Most interestingly, and I've put it into the chat as well, her work has been supported by the Arts Council, and her work, called Confined, is a virtual reality poetry film created with the visual artist Paul Kinsella, released in September 2020, and again, I think addressing these issues of the confinement that we've had since March 2020, but also looking at these different issues of the body in space, but also looking at the connections of our ecological and social interdependencies that have become all too obvious since COVID in recent years. But she's here with us today, so without further ado, I will hand it over to Alice. So thanks very much, Alice.
Thank you, Nessa, and thank you, other Nessa. When Nessa O'Mahony and I discussed the narrative arc that was emerging with Empty House, I was adamant about one thing: that this book would end on hope. I did not want to give in to the fatalistic narrative that we were doomed. 2 years on, following COP26, I'm not hopeless, but I'm certainly less optimistic, and I'm a hell of a lot angrier. My goal with Empty House was twofold: to engage writers and readers on the subject, and to raise money to support those who knew what they were doing, namely Friends of the Earth Ireland. We achieved those goals, I hope, but it's undeniable that it was the tiniest drop in the rising oceans. Literature as morality. We live in such a contentious age: virtue signaling, woke culture, content warnings. It's a matter of debate whether one should read the books of someone whose opinions they disagree with. The idea of literature as moral has never sat quite right with me, when what literature does best, in my opinion, is to reflect and interrogate the human condition. But this is also the naive opinion of someone with few true struggles in their life. Civil disobedience. We have run out of time for most things. We have run out of time to procrastinate, for denial, for self-indulgence, for humoring, for cowardice. We have run out of time to prevent disaster. But we've not run out of hope. Damage limitation goes a long way. We're looking at the difference between adapting as a species and an uninhabitable planet. I stand behind the call from scientists and activists for civil disobedience. Never again will I shake hands with or smile politely at a politician that has not committed to the divestment of the fossil fuel industry in Ireland. I do not support the idea that land is a commodity and agriculture is a right. I will no longer be understanding with people who think it's not their problem because they'll die before the worst of it hits. The time for diplomacy has passed. There's no debate here. How facts have become debatable is one of the great tragedies of our age. The narrative for so long has been about saving the earth, saving ourselves from the effects of the climate. But the primary cause of this crisis is not environmental, it's political. Political change is our only hope. In his Guardian article following COP26, George Monbiot explains that research shows by mobilising just 25% of the population, social convention flips. Ireland is an excellent example of how a grassroots movement can change the attitude of a country. Look at the marriage equality referendum, look at repeal the 8th. When we want to, when we need to, we can. Art is action. Art has a role in the climate crisis because art is an integral part of being human. Somewhere in the last few years, we stopped making art and started making content. The line between the two is blurry as it's supposed to be. Who decides what's worth the name of art? I have my own criteria, most of which should be of little interest to other people. One that I'd like to share, though, is that content fuels capitalism. That is its primary function. Art, on the other hand, is for humans. It is for the artist. It is to make a connection between the artist and the people looking, listening, reaching. A common thread of inquiry in literature is how to live, or indeed why to live at all. This is a tradition that we must continue and expand upon, because that is the question that humanity is answering with its actions. Why live at all? As a species, we are choosing death. This won't just be a mass extinction, it will be a mass murder-suicide. These are uncomfortable truths. Just like all art, they are subjective perspectives on an objective reality. That reality being, human activity is changing our climate, and only human action can stop this change. Camus said that in art, rebellion is consummated and perpetuated in the act of real creation, not in criticism or commentary. We as a country have had the good fortune of relative comfort these last several decades. I imagine most of you here today are doing so from a position of no immediate danger. We have come of age in an Ireland that allows us the luxury of contemplation, amateur armchair philosophers setting the world to rights with smartphones in hand. It is time to remember our roots. We must look to our collective history of art as rebellion. In our own country, we have a rich heritage of rebel songs. So fuck your Union Jack, we want our country back. Camus said that rebellion cannot exist without the feeling that somewhere and somehow one is right. Where is the chant now, the call for justice? Fuck your right to burn and frack, we want our children's future back. You did not become an artist to withhold the status quo. As an artist, and indeed as a human, you've got to use your damn voice, because it's all you've got. Thanks, that's all I've got to say today.
Fantastic, Alice. Thank you so much. And I think you've echoed and channeled, I think, a lot of the concerns that many people have had in recent years, but also particularly, I suppose, focusing on the frustrations, I think, as well, that have emerged since COP26 as well. And I think this is very, very valuable points to make. And indeed, I was actually even thinking as well about, kind of opening up questions of, what is culture? And I was reminded of a quote actually from the book on the Rossport 5, which was about the Shell to Sea campaign in North Mayo, about the gas pipeline that was being brought on shore there, by a quote by Micheál Shine, one of the Rossport 5, and he was trying to explain to people what place means for them, how we would be couched now in terms of climate justice in different ways, but he said how place and culture, and trying to understand that the place around them was so important, but also thinking about what is it going to be like in generations hence. And he said, and this is from the book, Our Story, the Rossport 5, he said, when people talk about culture, it's a page in the Times that no one reads or the Sunday newspaper. But for us, it's a different thing. It's all of living everyday survival. And again, I think this kind of points in many ways to the idea that culture and arts, they're not just something that's nice to be put on at the end of something or the icing on the cake, but it's absolutely a vital point of our critical infrastructure, and a way for us to think about that in those terms. I think it's really, really important. So we're going to move to another part of the west of Ireland, so to Rianach Níl, as we say said before at a previous webinar, I said cogito ergo Zoom. So unfortunately, we're not able to be physically present, but I think part of the advantages of this is that we can have people coming in from different parts of the world to join us today. And indeed, we have, I think we'd over almost 200 people registered for the webinar from different parts of the world. But Rianach isn't too far away from me, just down the road. And we're delighted to have Rianach back with us. She's a very good friend of ours in Irish Studies here at NUI Galway. She's over 20 years experience in performance, curation, and socially engaged arts practice and community education, primarily in the area of contemporary dance practice. Her work itself and her own practice has no fixed borders in its focus, particularly on issues of civic dialogue, and has involved collaborations across dance, architecture, film, geography, engineering, and health in recent years. She's won international choreography awards, and she's taught internationally, and her work has been presented. And her dance film with the Macushla Dance Club, the area, is one that I would most highly recommend everybody to watch. To echo, I suppose, what Alice was saying, it's such a hopeful film in many ways, but it also speaks to the power of community and the power of connection as well, that what art can bring in many ways. Rianach's work was the kind of the flagship image that we used for this session, and she was also part of the Galway, the European Capital of Culture Galway 2020, with her work Hope It Rains, Sun and New Dunnan. So Rianach, without further delay, over to you for your thoughts and ideas on what we're discussing today.
Thanks a million, and it is great to be back with you. I've been making work, climate activism work, since 2011, when I was invited by the University of Malmö to work with the landscape architecture department, who were trying to galvanize the public to take the sea level rising risk of a local area called Höganäs seriously. And they'd actually been invited by the local council. So quite differently to here, they've been invited by the local council and planners to do a project that would, because they were finding that nobody was interested. They were saying this place is at a very high risk of becoming an island and of significant land loss due to sea level rising. And what they're finding is that nobody was interested. So I made a performance, a promenade performance through the streets of Höganäs with them, and which was televised on national Swedish radio and television. And the debate and the discussion, the public engagement and the discussion about what to do there did increase. Since then, I've been working in Galway. Myself and artist Joe Lee and other participating artists created a work called Drowned Galway, which is a series of photo montages showing a kind of a surreal vision of Galway underwater. So what it could possibly be like in the very near future. And I'm currently working on a project called Bantaneir in Ceathrú in the Connemara Gaeltacht, where we are, I'll talk a little bit more about it in a second, but it is about diversified renewable energy production and in the hands of locals. So this invitation made me sit back and go, well, you know, why do you do this? What's the role of the artist? What can we possibly contribute? First of all, I think it's the same role and responsibility of every single adult in society, which is scream loudly and act quickly. I think Alice put it very well. Everybody's put it very well. There is no time to delay at all. So it's like everybody in every walk of life needs to be screaming from the rooftops to make the necessary changes. So when you're working at this kind of, I suppose everybody understands that really delicate balance between despair and then complacency. If you despair too much, you won't do anything. If you think that there might be a chance to maybe leave it for a while, then nothing happens. So I feel that one of the things that motivates me to carry on with this is like we have to have courage, and we have to do something. And as I said, we have done this before. We're doing it now. The vast majority of people in Ireland have acted with great care. concern for themselves and for strangers in changing their actions during the pandemic. The vast majority have acted selflessly for the common good. So I think that we have everything that we need to act. We just need to do it now. So I've been thinking a lot about that kind of situation where, because it happens in your own practice, where you're just oscillating between the fight, flight, freeze reactions to a huge crisis. Some days it's very hard. It's very hard to do anything. Your brain just feels like it's frozen. So one thing that I'm interested in imagining with the community, imagining alternative near futures and modeling them and trialing them in the works. That's kind of really what it is about. It's with the small limited resources that you have in an arts project, can you model, can you try out a potential solution? And I think there's such a simple choice that we face at the moment, which is between apocalypse and actually a far, far better future than the present. So I'm not sure if we focus enough on that fact that we could have, if we do these simple steps, decentralized renewable power with clean environment, we have such an opportunity to have a more just, cleaner, healthier, livable world. Or we face the apocalypse, and anybody who thinks that Fortress Europe can ride it out is, well, I don't want to live in a future in which I may be safe, but there are billions of people dying in my world. So the current project Points in Air, and before that there was a project called Weatherbots, where artists are creating artworks that are renewable energy generators with the public. And behind that is the question of what a landscape of decentralized power could be like, and what effect that could have on Gaeltacht culture. What would the Gaeltacht be like in 5 to 10 years' time if we have diversified ownership and local management of energy production, which is a very realistic proposition with renewable energy? And what would it be like if we had the local management of the decarbonisation of our peatlands? So I'm hoping to empower more people to act through this project. We just started with a year. And I suppose one of the things that's made me reflect is that the nature of what as my responsibility as an artist has changed in the last 10 years because of this, because it's no longer that one step remove where you create work and then it's up to the audience how they react. It's up to them what they do. I now feel a responsibility to create something in order to have a more directed action. I no longer judge what I'm doing according to what the value of the artwork in itself is. I'm actually also feel it has to engender a change, or it isn't successful. So that's a very different place to be in than before. I agree with Alice and everybody. We have to participate in systemic change. A just transition will not happen through capitalism. And we already have the solutions. We just need proper democracy. We don't have it. We need to strengthen it. We need more representative democracy. We need to constantly remind ourselves that we actually have a UN Charter of Human Rights. We are all equal and have equal human rights, and that includes the generations that have not yet been born. So past the art making, I feel I can't look at it just like that. I'm going to be participating in politics. I'm going to be campaigning for climate action candidates. And I think artists and everybody needs to storm onto as many of our state boards as we can, stateboards.ie, to check that out. We need to train ourselves in disruption in as many ways as we possibly can. I think people are wary of change. I think people are afraid of being made fools of being the person that sacrifices while their neighbors don't, of being in the unjust part of the unjust transition. And we need to call that out. We need to galvanize people. We need to empower people to go, actually, this change is worth it. Societal change comes to the ground up. So individual action is paramount, but as artists, we also have to call out the bullshit and the hypocrisy of the structures that are around us. We have a country that is continuing fossil fuel subsidies. We're continuing fossil fuel extraction, and we are even discussing carbon offsets, which is stealing from my children. So we have to be also vigilant about the hypocrisy and greenwashing in art, and our artwork being used for greenwashing. So we have to think about how can we travel for art? How can we be part of an international community and not, to mind our carbon footprint? We have, I think, sustainable audits of how we make work. Can we really afford anymore to make works that may be about climate change, but they guzzle energy, or they light up the night and they disturb wildlife? Are we modeling a just transition in our own work? So starting here and then looking out. Can we do this? Can we change track in time? Yes, we can. Absolutely, we can, because that's right now. It's today. It's today that we do that. We have the solutions, and there's some pretty straightforward ones there. So in a way, I suppose one of the last things I want to say is, like, Deirdre made a point absolutely beautifully about the need for humility, and that's a driving force. Is we can get bogged up in being very clever and seeing all the problems that we can't do anything, but actually, if we're really humble about it, there are some very simple steps that we can all make. So that's the reflections I've had from participating in this.
Thanks so much, Carmela Macatharina. It's so valuable to have your perspective on all of these issues, and I think, again, echoing what Deirdre had said as well too, the need for speculative spaces, and I know that your own work has been very much about trying to open up that kind of space across time, across geographies, but also across disciplines as well. I know it's one of the comments that came up in the Q&A as well, about needing to move beyond disciplinary boundaries and beyond institutions as well in different ways. So it's something we can come to at the Q&A in particular there. We're now very happy to welcome Helen O'Donoghue. Helen is coming to us from IMA in Dublin, the Irish Museum of Modern Art, where she's the senior curator and the head of engagement and learning. So Helen, over to you. We're going to cross to Shannon now, so you're very welcome to go away.
Thank you so much, Nessa, and thanks to all the organisers for including Emma's voice in this conversation, because there's so much it's so reciprocal, what we can give and receive. What I'd like to talk a little bit about here today is just what Emma has done in the recent past and what it's planning to do next year in relation to creating a platform for art and artists and activism. So since the lockdown and the impact of the climate crisis through the pandemic, these issues have been part of our daily conversations and programming here and in how we're developing policies at IMA. Our discussion about IMA as a civic place, the 48-acre site that we sit on, and its relevance and importance, particularly when the pandemic hit locally and people experienced lockdowns of 2 and 5 kilometres. We were seen as one of the green lungs in Dublin 8. The work of the Office of Public Works was really impressive in wilding the meadow and the graveyards. There was a growing awareness in all of us, I think, of the importance of the biodiversity of the site, its meadow, graveyards and formal gardens. And IMA's role as a civic partner with our neighbours and stakeholders, including the wonderful work that Common Ground Arts Agency does and the Fatima Groups United programmes do. So we started to contemplate the power that we have as an institution to create a space to share and exchange socially engaged arts practices and create a platform for debate. And this was realised in 2020 and 2021 through a programme which we called IMA Outdoors, which activated the campus from gate to gate and created safe environments to socially connect audiences. The project piloted new artist commissions, performances, talks, workshops, tours, pop-up exhibitions, and open-air cafes. It created an inspiring programme of activities and events to celebrate IMA's 30th birthday, which also landed in 2021. reflecting on the museum's recent contemporary history alongside with the site's historical resonances. The programme lies in ideas of civic agency, self-determination, global interconnections, environmental concerns, and what it means to be radically public by creating an inclusive, meaningful space for all ages to relax, contemplate, and enjoy. IMA Outdoors also commissioned a number of new site-specific art programming and embraced a blended suite of online and on-site and online digital engagements with the intention of reaching a wider ranging audience. IMA Outdoors offered the museum a valuable benchmark for the planning and effective execution of outdoor programming and commissioning of public artworks for the grounds, which was merged also with our commercial work here on site. We had a particular call out titled A Radical Plot, which invited artists who came to work and live in residence here in IMA. We developed a series of biodiversity tours through the education programme in conjunction with the Office of Public Work Gardeners. And we also developed our social prescription programme, which runs with St. James's Hospital and the Mercer's Institute for Creative Ageing, with programming on site. And we also led out on a research-based project with young people, exploring and sharing knowledge, responding to the call of climate crisis, called Breaking Cover. We are also then we looked at our collections, and for any of you who've been in Dublin recently, you may be aware that we've opened the whole museum to reflect on 30 years of collecting at IMA. And that's under a global title called The Narrow Gate of the Here and Now. And it's divided into 4 chapters. And the second chapter is exploring the Anthropocene as seen through the work of artists, from very traditional artists such as Albrecht Dürer right through to contemporary, such as the Otolith Group. And the Otolith Group will present their work in 2022 in a solo show. And this work will offer us an opportunity to do a really deep dive into, alongside our collection, into some of these issues that are concerning people. So this work has led us to look at IMA's role as a civic space. And in autumn 2022, we are curated by our director, Annie Fletcher. We are planning a very ambitious pilot project, which will be an eco art convention titled Melting Point. And this will be a 3-day fair showcasing the best in innovation and creativity in the climate crisis movement. It'll be a meeting of the finest minds in art, engineering, architecture, design, bioscience, and food, and will offer an opportunity for people to come and share and showcase and activate and scream loudly, to pick up from some of the previous presenters about the world that we are living in and hopefully can shape and affect. Over IMA's 30-year history, it has been a space for activism. As an institution concerned with modern and contemporary culture, IMA inherently is well disposed towards innovation and experimentation, which are critical conditions for the creation of new projects and programs that capture the imagination, build momentum, and have the power to create social change. In a world that is changing so rapidly, IMA is constantly looking ahead, radically rethinking the role of the cultural institution and developing a boundary, pushing vision which focuses on its role as a radically public space, a global connector, and a catalyst for change. We hope that IMA's focus on sustainable practices, our desire to try new approaches, and our willingness to acknowledge our new learnings and embrace change will impact the industry through our peers, artists, audience, communities, and contractors. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Helen. And it's wonderful to have you here with us this afternoon, but also to share the experiences of IMA over the last 2 years in particular, but also it points to the really important role of public institutions for a national dialogue and this, and also that the options and the possibilities and the roles and responsibilities that are there of all national institutions in different ways to address these issues and to bring people from different aspects of Irish life together. So thanks very much. for that. We'll now move on to our next contributor is Elle Putnam. Elle is a digital artist and scholar based at the School of English and Creative Arts at NUI Galway, and she's also a wonderful digital artist and philosopher as well. So Elle, I'll pass it over to you. If you want me to share some of your images, or if you're happy just to speak as you wish, you just let me know.
If you could just put the images up and I'll just speak over them. That'd be great. Okay, so when I was asked to be part of this webinar, the question that came to my mind is, what can art do in our times of crisis? French philosopher Bernard Stiegler defines the Anthropocene as an era of industrial capitalism in which calculation prevails over every other criteria of decision-making, and where algorithmic and mechanical becoming is concretized and materialized as logical automation and automatism. We have to think about the Anthropocene as technological, and this comes from the Industrial Revolution to today's automatic societies. This includes data mining on a mass scale, ubiquitous computing, algorithmic decision-making that's impacting nearly every aspect of our lives. Technology involves not just machines, hardware, and software, but is part of a broader milieu that involves individuals, and these are physical individuals, including objects, and living beings, societies, and geographies. And this is coming from a French philosopher, Gilbert Simondon. And we think of these milieux as relational ecologies. Next slide, Nessa. Stiegler proposes the Neganthropocene as an exit from the Anthropocene. And art can function as neg-anthropic gestures, aesthetic experiences that exceed the capacity of calculation, inviting a new politics of technology. Noel Fitzpatrick describes how there are two main features to Stiegler's definition of the Neganthropocene. The first is that it recognizes that not everything can be captured, and the significance of what exists outside measurability and calculation. And this includes aesthetics as the sharing of the sensible. It also means reharnessing technologies to enable reflection, deliberation, conflict, and reason to counter these patterns of automation. Next slide, Nessa. Philosopher Yaqui proposes that the perspectives introduced through art enable a rethinking of technologies, as the, quote, varieties of experience of art are discovered not only in style and technique, but also in the different non-linear logics and different pathways to truth it establishes. Next slide, Nessa. Hui points out that with sensors and algorithms, we can supplement our senses, much like we use the telescope and the microscope to make visible orders of magnitude that lie beyond our sense of perception. And this may change the way we understand the world. But this data, these are just facts. And in order to inquire into the unknown, quote, we have to ask where the unknown is from and how it is determined. Hui emphasizes that for art to respond to our epoch, we have to confront the crisis we are faced with today. We have to produce new sensibilities that will be able to give science and technology new directions and frameworks. Computation and data are driving public policies and solutions pertaining to climate change. And while these are important, they're not enough. Art and aesthetics create generative information that doesn't just introduce new perspectives, but enables us to appreciate, if not understand fully, these complexities in ways that may enable us to more effectively counter climate change's disastrous effects. We are able to grasp the sublime scope and scale of what we face while forging new neganthropic relations with technology. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Elle. I'll just stop sharing your wonderful slides there. I think all of those points are really, really important. I mean, we're coming back to this question of public policy and engagement and climate action, and what's driving it, but also what are the drivers behind it as well, but also what are the gaps that are out there that we need to be aware of. So with that in mind, we're delighted to have Charles Joly here with us, who's the Head of Sustainability at the London School of Economics in the UK. And I came across Charles's work on the blog post where he and his colleague had written about the need for the arts and the social sciences to be included in any discussions on sustainability. Otherwise, it was going to be, in some sense, less successful, have less successful outcomes for society. So, Charles, we're delighted to have you. I think you're actually are you in Wales right now, is it, or are you in London?
I'm in London and virtually in Wales.
Oh, okay, very good, very good. Well, it's lovely to have you in any event. So I'll pass it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nessa. And I've really enjoyed all the speakers, like such a diversity of perspectives and views, really fantastic. Yeah, so I'm Charles at the London School of Economics and LSE. At LSE, our commitment to sustainability is really part of who we are, and it's a key priority of our 2030 corporate strategy. And last year in 2020, we launched our sustainability strategy plan to try to maximize our impact in shaping a sustainable world, be it through our education, our research, our engagement and leadership, how we manage our investments, and our campus operations. And really, that plan has been a catalyst for action. And I think we can't underestimate the scale, the sheer scale of change which is required for the transition to an environmentally sustainable world and more inclusive world in general, and to a net zero carbon economy and circular economy. It's really truly unprecedented, and I would re-emphasize those points that some speakers made. That is, a really quite a bright and inspiring future to look forward to in terms of like being a more inclusive, cleaner, more healthy world to live in. But of course, like the key challenges to make this transition to a sustainable net carbon world are actually more social than technological, because most of the technology we need is already available. And that's why at LSE we're making the case that social sciences, humanities, and the arts are really critical in making that transition successful. And LSE joined forces with the British Academy, the Academy of Social Sciences, and the Art Councils in England to promote SHAPE, S-H-A-P-E, as a collective name for social sciences, humanities, and the arts for people in the economy, to complement and work alongside STEM disciplines for impact and positive change. So if you've not heard of SHAPE, like look it up and start using it, because I think this can become a very popular concept, like alongside STEM. And I think, us talking about SHAPE is really to try to make the case that it's not just engineers and hard sciences like that are going to deliver the required solutions, because we need to go alongside that the right policies, regulations, like from the social sciences sphere, but we also need humanities and philosophy. I'll give you a really interesting recent example, is that octopuses, crabs, and lobsters are going to be soon recognized as sentient beings under UK law, thanks to findings like from the LSE Department of Philosophy. And as a result, we receive greater welfare protection because it's been demonstrated that there is really strong scientific evidence that these animals have the capacity to experience pain, distress, or harm. So, and that's coming from Department of Philosophy. How fantastic is that? And of course, the arts, because we really need to excite people about the prospect of a more just and sustainable world. and making sustainability inclusive, accessible to a really broad audience, attractive and easy, and it's really make people aspire and desire it. So it's really important that we invite everyone and engage everyone into this conversation. And that's why we're making the case that really shapes that incredible contribution to make to the sustainability debate. And I think we talked a lot about climate justice and social justice. And what's interesting that in the UK, the Climate Assembly recently identified fairness as a top consideration for the path to net zero, recognizing the need for a just transition that doesn't impact disproportionately the most vulnerable in society. And of course, that's looking at a national level, but at an international level, we've got, at a global scale, we've got this global climate justice problem to resolve. And how can we make sure that we've got inclusive development for everyone? So although engineering and technical solutions are required to make consumption more sustainable, less wasteful, and move away from a linear, like make, use, waste system to a circular economy, shape subjects are so important, helping us understand ourselves, others, and how human behaviors mold the world around us. So all I would say is that we all have a part to play in this, and especially the shape disciplines. And certainly at LSE, we're committed to play our part, including educating the future leaders of tomorrow. And we're embedding sustainability right across our curriculum, because we know that sustainability is going to be like needed from, be it fashion designers, architects, philosophers, and artists, of course. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles. And I've just put into the chat there the blog that you co-wrote with your colleague as well. And also the reference to SHAPE as well. So the website is there for people to follow up on afterwards as well. But I think your discussion about the role of philosophy, it brings to mind again, it echoes what Alice had started to look at as well in terms of the role of literature, that it opens up this question that's been there for many, many centuries that philosophers and writers have looked at, which is the question of how to live the good life, and what does that mean in many ways. And I suppose in terms of the climate context, in terms of which we are now, it is what does a more just world look like in that context as well too. We would be moving to Richard Carney as well from Boston College, but today Richard is unable to join us, but he will be back, I'm sure, on another occasion. So we will be returning to those kinds of questions with Richard at some point in the near future. So we'll move now to the west coast of Canada, and we're going to welcome Derek Gladwin with us, who works in the area of environmental literacy, sustainability education, and also Irish studies as well. His wonderful book, co-edited with Christine Cusick, who I think might be in the Zoom room as well too, Unfolding Irish Landscapes, is a wonderful collection of essays looking at all of these questions of the environment and how we live in it in an Irish context. So I would highly recommend it. And also his more recent book, Ecological Exile, opens up these broader questions from the perspective of environmental humanities, but in terms of different modes of engagement and language and literacy as well. So Derek, we're delighted to have you with us again in Galway, and I'll pass it over to you. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks for the introduction, Nessa, and thanks for all the presentations so far and discussion. I'm really thrilled to be here, joining everyone from the traditional and ancestral unceded territories on the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples, and now what's called Vancouver, Canada here. And I find it particularly important to acknowledge the unceded and Indigenous land that I'm on when speaking about COP26, and how decolonization plays a significant role in our discussions around climate change arts, and that'll sort of be added in what I'm going to talk. So my aim for this little short segment is to discuss aspect of COP26 from a perspective of imagining energy transitions and futures. The COP conferences, because they are political entities in many regards, often need agreements and concrete plans. This makes, and this year, the primary argument was difference of degrees. I mean, really quite literally, how do we limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? That was a major focus. And the answer is obviously to many, largely reducing coal and fossil fuels through reductions in emissions, at least 45%. by 2030. What the one of the attempt to concretize this plan. And the good news is that because fossil fuels are finally addressed as the primary issue, around 3 dozen countries, including the United States, pledged to stop funding fossil fuel projects abroad by the end of 22. But as we know, this is not a new story. So we'll see how much action actually occurs here. The problem is that remains this issue really remains a social and cultural problem, and we still don't really know how to talk about energy transition, or more importantly, how we might imagine an energy transition. World leaders are reacting instead of co-creating; they are planning and thinking instead of reworlding. So it's really sort of a top-down exercise. This may all seem basic enough to us in the room, at least. But I think this oblique distinction is often overlooked. Sort of what we call an energy transition must be accompanied by an imagination and rewritten narrative about those cultural epistemologies, if we want them that way, largely govern not only our fuel economies through issues of late capitalism, but all the ways that seeps into our cultural imagining. Inhibiting our ability to imagine outside of oil culture or a world after oil. What would that even look like? We even know how to imagine such a place. And so my research in humanities and arts-based education explores how people experience language and narrative, and how these experiences impact people's understanding and decisions about our collective environmental futures. And within this work, two frequent questions arise, also relate significantly to COP26, both of which can be framed in the context of narrative. The first question is, who gets to imagine our energy transition futures? And the second is, what are the best ways to do it? And our panel here has been gathered to really address these questions, but very much hearing others' answers to these. And I'm really grateful for that. This is only a necessary intervention. And it's to me that while COP26 is the ideal time and the location to explore these larger questions, they are not priority. Instead, the question is really how do we use carbon in the atmosphere, how we might tackle emissions and so on. And these types of questions are a bit like focusing on the symptom rather than the underlying sickness. And the other question is, who decides the plan and what ontological basis is treatment? So perhaps I will just close with anecdote and to sort of illustrate this. And so building the climate strikes of 2018 and 2020, I worked with a small team of researchers to co-lead a project titled International Youth Deliberation on Energy Futures 2020. And the project brought together hundreds of secondary high school students from 22 different schools in 8 countries. And really the upshot of this was that they were galvanized to really speak about their collective experience, particularly through storytelling. And I'll put this in the little, I'll put this in the chat here when I'm done. But I cite this example because unlike COP26 theme of the national high school students, their fundamental aim really to answer those 2 underlying questions of who to imagine these futures and what are the best way to do it. So global youth are a huge part of this imagining, but so are other underrepresented groups such as artists, of course, in this context, but also indigenous peoples and those living in the global south. So I get the real question we need to be asking, in my opinion, is how do we include other voices, decolonize the normative assumptions about who will reimagine and recreate our energy futures. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Derek. That's a really, really important point. I think while a lot of the discussion has been about a transdisciplinary approach to dealing with this, it also has to be an intersectional one, and it also has to be one that includes what are seen as marginal voices. But if you live in the margins, that's the center of your world. So often these margins are seen from the perspective of a European white norm, which has to be severely questioned and put under pressure as well too. Well, we're now moving to the Q&A part of our session. So I'd like to invite all of the panelists to put their cameras on and their mics as well too. And first of all, just to go to the chat, I just have to say congratulations to all of the attendees. I think all of them have stayed with us. We've run a little bit over time, but that's all to the better, I think. And just to open with just a couple of comments here, one from Ashley Cahalan, who was asking about the role of art in storing, interrogating and creating knowledge and feelings. And she was wondering if anyone on the panel has any thoughts on the idea of art as sustaining activists and people concerned about climate and environmental issues. So art as a sustaining practice in itself for those involved in climate action. So I wonder if anybody in the panel audience might like to comment on that or have any thoughts on that from Ashley.
Can I just come in there, Nessa, for a moment?
Yeah,
Connor here.
Connor, thanks.
Yeah,
Connor
hi.
Newman, yeah, hi.
I actually answered Ashley's question in there, but I can't see where my answer has gone. But there's a Rutledge series, Studies in Culture and Sustainable Development. And I think it's the third edited volume to come out of that series, Form, Art and the Environment, Engaging in Sustainability. So I'll put the link to that publication on the Q&A again or into the chat so you can see it. It's a very interesting series. I think there's about 10 titles in the series now, and if you haven't heard of it before, do have a browse in there because you'll find something to tick that box. And I suppose in that edited volume, you'll probably have the views and perspectives of quite a wide range of people on precisely that issue. So I'll put that into the box now, okay?
That's great. Thanks a million, Connor. As you're there on the Zoom screen, Connor, I might pull you back in again. I know that your own work has looked at the issue of heritage in particular, both past, present and future. And also I know you've spoken a lot about how culture, the people need to be reminded how culture is the fourth pillar of sustainability as well too. We've talked about this on our sustainability module at NUI Galway. So do you have any further thoughts or comments on what you've heard today from the panelists or just the theme of the discussion? You might just put your mic on as well there, Connor, when you're ready.
Nessa, I did that on purpose to give you a sample of the sound of the voice of those of us coming from cultural heritage in this whole debate. There's no sound at all. Our mouths are moving, our hands are gesticulating, and there's no sound coming out. Yeah, so it strikes me that the role and the responsibilities that the various speakers here, artists and so on, have been keen to declare their willingness to assume are shared by those of us who come to this from the direction of cultural heritage. And I just wanted to, I suppose, just to draw your attention to one document, because what's been kind of rolling away in the background, if you have had your ear to the ground on this since 2010, has been a growing international awareness of the role of culture and heritage in sustainability. And in fact, it started out speaking about cultural heritage, and then gradually people kind of dropped the heritage side of things and are now talking about culture. I don't see much of a difference, to be honest with you, between the two. But in 2015, the ministers of the states parties to the European Cultural Convention met in Namur, and they came out with a declaration, which the first paragraph of which is worth quoting from, because you don't hear this kind of language very often. And it really, to my mind, maps out the scale of the challenge facing us and the scale of the responsibility, the role and responsibility now being thrust on the culture sector and on cultural heritage and so on. So if you don't mind, it's quite short. Climate change, demographic changes, migration, political, economic, financial and social crises are having a significant impact on our societies and heritage. We need to be aware of these challenges and to work together to prevent a development where our societies are weakened and lack points of reference, are tempted to adopt inward-looking attitudes, are experiencing an erosion of traditional bonds, and sometimes risk rupturing or imploding. You never get that kind of language in international documents. I suspect it's against a backdrop of the the threat of Brexit and the rise of the right, and the fact that the right tends to fragment response, and this is a pushback. And this is, I think, the subtext to this and other declarations, the most recent one to come out at the end of July, that essentially there's an awareness that somehow or other, if we don't work together, we're not going to fix this. And we have to figure out all of the tools that we have available to us to get people to work together. And art and all of the arts have an enormously valuable contribution to make in terms of their ability to communicate en masse and to think outside the box, to get people, to arrest people's attention at that moment that it takes to realize that there's a different way of thinking about this. And so I think there's also a recognition that some art can be a little bit inaccessible, but heritage never is. Even if it's contested, it's still something that people can relate to. And so I think there's a very interesting fusion to be developed there between those two arenas of human activity. I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Conor. I'm glad we didn't keep you on mute there for a while. So always happy to have the voice as part of the conversation. But it also reminds me as well of, it's that oscillation between the doom and gloom, the hope and the despair kind of that we all kind of go through as well while dealing with this. And I think Alice had expressed that really clearly as well. But also to be reminded of often that, and again, I'm just thinking of what Rhiannoch had said about the majority of the population in Ireland's response to COVID was a very positive one of solidarity, of people helping each other out. And often what's interesting, and we've seen this with the different forms of citizens' assemblies as well, that both Alice had referenced as well earlier, that the people in the best possible sense of that category are often ahead of the curve in many ways of the politicians, and the politicians come in later in the day. I might ask Diarmuid maybe just to say a few words on that, because now Diarmuid has worked a lot on the citizens' assemblies in different contexts in DCU as well. So Diarmuid, what is your sense of what people are thinking about all of this, and are they dragging the politicians along kind of kicking and screaming in many ways?
Yeah, thanks, Nessa. So yes, I was involved in a peripheral way in the Citizens' Assembly for its deliberation on the topic of climate change. And in hindsight now, I think there's a risk of thinking that it was all kind of predetermined, that the outcome what was to be expected, because I guess the national debate and the global debate on climate change has evolved so much since the Citizens' Assembly with Greta Thunberg and with school strikes and so forth. But that moment, autumn 2017, was a moment when nationally really climate change wasn't on the agenda in Ireland in any significant way, and I had no idea going into that process what the outcomes were going to be like, and on questions such as people's willingness to pay higher taxes on greenhouse gas intensive products. The result in the end was 80% in favour, if I recall correctly. But I really wasn't sure which way the vote would go on that, if you like, and the conventional wisdom would have told us that citizens wouldn't be in favour of that, and more generally wouldn't be in favour of stronger measures on climate change, and also, of course, on the repeal of the Eighth Amendment. And I think what the process showed was that if you include citizens in an inclusive decision-making process that gives them time not just to absorb information, but to kind of internalize it, interrogate it, and discuss it with their fellow citizens. It's a really quite powerful way of including citizens in decision making, and it often generates outcomes that are at variance with what the conventional wisdom would tell us is where the public is at.
Thanks a million, Diarmuid. Would anyone else from the panel like to jump in there, or Any observations? No? Deirdre, you look like you're, oh, Nessa is moving. I thought it was Deirdre. We'll go Nessa first, then Deirdre.
At the O'Mahonys, you can't keep them down. No, I suppose, I mean, I've been really heartened by so many of the presentations here, and the absolute refusal to be downhearted or not sort of see that there is the possibility of change even at this late stage. And I suppose not uniquely, but the advantage that, you know, some of us have in the room here is access to audiences, to classrooms, to public platforms via blogs and social media, and you know, it's not as if we don't know what we'd like to say. I was really caught by Renoch's comment about how her attitude to her art has shifted from it's not art for art's sake anymore, if I understood Renoch. It's what can it change, and I think that's a really important thing for me to take away from this discussion.
Thanks a million, Nessa. We'll go to the other O'Mahony in the room.
Yeah, I suppose in thinking about how that public space is created, you know, the Citizens' Assembly, obviously that's one way, and it does allow space for face-to-face engagement, for what I would call slow engagement with different publics. And I think that's something that artists can bring to the whole question of who has a voice and who gets heard, is the capacity to create spaces for a slower and more intimate way of engaging with people in order that they get heard. And there's a point I just want to flag. I'm getting increasingly uneasy when disciplinary claims or knowledge claims are staked on behalf of disciplines or even transdisciplinary practice, because increasingly I think that actually we need to go beyond the whole notion of the discipline if we're to create the kind of seismic shift that's required culturally, socially, economically, practically, and sensitized to the wider world. Then we need to move away, and like, I'm conscious as somebody who's worked within academia as well as within the cultural sector, and you know, our identities are bound up in our practices and our knowledges, and yet we need to move beyond all of that. You know, the singular artist, yes, that's been kind of decried as a model with postmodernist practice and the rise of collaborative work, but actually now we need to go beyond that yet again, to imagining a way of being in the world that encompasses all life forms, and as artists we have a kind of duty to model, however gauche it might appear and however awkward and clumsy it might appear. We have a duty to try and make some kind of public sense of that aspiration.
Thanks a million, Deirdre. I think everybody, I think in the Zoom room would wholeheartedly agree with you. And I think one of the frustrations that many of us have that do work across the disciplines is that how many different structures are there. You're kind of working against inherited structures in many ways, and that the inherited silos of knowledge that we've inherited that are very 19th century. I mean, we work within a 19th century idea and model of knowledge in many ways, no longer really fits the 21st century of how we live, let alone what we want to think about in 50 years time or even 10 or 20 years time, and even how we're educating our children for the future. like is still a very different concept of now as of what it's going to be in 10 or 20 years time again. So I think absolutely all of those points are very well made indeed. One of the comments that just came in there from the Q&A as well from Janine Woods, so thanks very much Janine, is that the question of the decolonial is something that's coming up. It seems to be threading through with decolonizing knowledge or just questioning knowledge or inherited knowledges in many ways. And I know that Derek had acknowledged that in terms of his own positionality on the western part of Canada as well. Derek, would you like to say anything on that, maybe on the whole decolonization of knowledge and how we need to think differently and kind of incorporate other voices, but also change the terms and conditions of what the conversation is in the first place? If you want to turn your mic off. Your audio was a teeny little bit scratchy earlier, but we were able to listen to you and make you out. So.
Okay, well, great, thanks. Sorry for the technological glitches. Yeah, and I saw the question from Caroline as well. And you know, it's a huge question, and in some ways, the simple answer is in the teaching and work that I do. I mean, it is I work on unceded territory, treaty territories that was never ceded, and it's still an issue today in terms of who is this. And you know, who's profiting on this land, and so you know, my context is very present. So this is something that gets brought up in classes a lot. It's something that happens in research, and really comes down to sort of, you know, we need a paradigm shift. Obviously, this is, everyone's kind of said this in their own way, and that paradigm shift. The question is, you know, whose paradigm is that shifting? You know, we know that the paradigm that we're in now is not working, but how do we include other paradigms? So it seems to me that the people at the table and the people making massive decisions are oftentimes the one still in the dominant paradigm now, and the Western Enlightenment, where it is you know, this kind of the problem. So yes, in that sense, it's just trying to decolonize and thinking about how we decolonize. In my case, terms, how we decolonize our work, how we decolonize energy. You know, all this I think is point to the right direction. And yes, you know, speaking of the discussions today, the idea of incremental change versus change now. But I do think something like this is probably both, and also it can be incremental, and it can be now trying to get that, you know, Monbiot's 25%. And you know, how do we capture that? It seems to me that is very capturable within that model. But that's the impasse in some ways is shifting the perception of the pair more than it is anything else. And we have models for it. We have really amazing people around the world that do this work. So, you know, maybe time to put the spotlight there a bit more.
Okay, thanks a billion, Derek. That was great. Anybody from the panel want to respond there? Alice, I see. Do you want to jump in?
I agree absolutely, and it's all connected, isn't it? I was reading is it Christine's comment to Nessa about the that there's a sense of, she said there's a sense of human community that is similarly lost in a creeping way because of our disconnection from sensory knowledge frameworks. And I think the role of social media and of the individual being distracted from the physical world, being taken out of the physical world, as just increasing all the time, and we're not as in touch with, as Nessa said, with our animal selves, but also just the world, the natural world around us, in the same way as we might have been even kind of 30 years ago, not even speaking kind of pre-industrial revolution, and it's gathering speed all the time. And just that idea of, I suppose it's all connected. Even what Deirdre was saying about, you know, moving beyond the discipline and the, you know, we've lived in a very individualist age. We have an identity that's tied up in what we are as a capitalist tool, essentially, and moving so much online and seeing ourselves as this brain, as this as, you know, this commodity, this brand, it's just a fuel for like capitalism. It's just a way to distract from what's going on in the natural world. And unless we break it all, unless we move away from each thing, they're all connected, then the creeping back towards disaster is just inevitable.
Thanks, Alice. And again, I think this kind of other theme that's run through everybody's kind of discussion today and has come up in the Q&A as well is the idea of connection, and whether it's a visceral kind of connection to where we live or with each other, or a visceral connection to the planetary predicament, that it's the role of that art can help us think through that in a very meaningful way, that people can connect and feel in a way that maybe the data science and other ways of presenting material doesn't actually help us in that sense. It's a different form of engagement, I suppose, really. I'm conscious of the time, and also it's getting dark outside here. It's been getting dark out here for a while. I actually realized that there a minute ago. I've been so engrossed on my screen. I've been disconnected completely from the real world, my God. But any final comments or thoughts or suggestions before we wrap up the session? And say thanks to Derek as well for getting up at the crack of dawn and joining us as well. So it's great to have you from Canada, Derek.
If I could say something, just to say, I just think picking up on Alice and others' point about that connection and disconnection, and the isolation that is a natural byproduct of the pandemic and the lack of freedom to move about without worrying, and picking up on what you said, Nessa, earlier on about the importance of institutions like NUIG Galway, or indeed the Irish Museum of Modern Art, I suppose acting on the power that we have been given and the responsibility we've been given to actually be a platform for citizenship and create opportunities for people to meet, and ideally to create those connections in real time rather than always in virtual. So I just want to say, on behalf of myself, on behalf of Emma, this has been an extraordinary meeting of minds here, and thank you very, very much, Nessa, for the opportunity to participate.
Oh, not at all, Helen. Thank you so much. And I think that idea of a platform for citizenship is something that, I know Rianach had mentioned the idea of Fortress Europe, and we've seen the concerns with how the climate crisis were coming to our shores all the more in 2015, and what has happened politically since then, but also what may happen down the road is something of great concern for many of us. But a comment, I think, just echoing your comment, Helen, again, and it brings up this discussion as well in terms of what is the role of public communication and how do we communicate these ideas, how do we create these spaces, but also we have to kind of fight to work to create these spaces, but also to kind of to enlarge them and widen them out in different ways. So I suppose I would hope that in terms of our own abilities and practices and our own roles in different contexts, that we can continue to do that in different ways, both now and in the future again. I might, as we're on that, I might maybe swing around to bring the session to a close. I just want to say, Garmila Mahagi Galer, also of the Goluadar, August and the Quinn Capina Galer, August on Cora of Ian, Bishop Hinta Garfad. And it was just so lovely to have the different conversations. I know it was really hard to put you to the pin of your collar by saying 5 minutes, please, but you were all wonderful. And I think the passion, the energy, the frustration, all of those things are really important to acknowledge and to capture and to share in different ways. And we all oscillate between that. I feel like kind of like the weather forecast. I feel like the peaks and the troughs, and I go through like that from day to day, depending on whether I'm listening to the news or not. But I think that we can take great hope from sessions like this and from each other, and from the students that we meet, our friends, our neighbours, someone bring you over a bowl of soup if you're isolating with COVID, somebody minding somebody, or saying the floods are coming, I'm going to help you move your car out of the car park in Salt Hill, which has happened to more than one of us on occasion. And I think to remind ourselves, that very often the general public are often ahead of the game, and we just have to help the others to catch up a little bit along the way. So I'd like to say thank you all so much to the attendees as well. You've been stalwarts, nearly here for 2 hours. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you back again in the Zoom room, and hopefully in person in all the different locations, whether it's going to IMA, whether it's going to art exhibitions, whether it's going to poetry readings. We'd love to be back listening to poets talking, seeing Rianach's work in person, and also seeing you all at NUI Galway at some point in the future as well. So on behalf of Future Earth Ireland and the Moore Institute, Garmila Mahagi Galer, agus Ihoa. Okay, thank you very much.